Ever been in one of those situations, where your gut's telling you one thing, but then your brain's all, hold on, gotta be logical here. Or maybe a time when empathy, like really feeling what someone else is going through, turned out to be the most crucial skill. Well, in Leaders Eat Last, Simon Sinek dives right into those kind of scenarios. He kicks it off with this incredible story about a helicopter pilot, Johnny Bravo, flying into this super dangerous valley in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the thing about that story that always gets me is, we usually think about technical skills being the key in those high-pressure situations. But Bravo, he actually points to empathy as his biggest asset in that moment. Even goes so far as to say there are fates worse than death, like making it back alive when the guys he was supposed to rescue, they didn't. Talk about a powerful way to start a book about leadership, right? And it sets the stage for Sinek's whole argument about creating what he calls a circle of safety. Basically, it's this environment where everyone feels safe and valued. And not just by the people in charge, but by each other, too. Which brings us to Bob Chapman, the CEO of Hazen Sandiaker. His whole leadership journey starts with this simple observation. It's his first day as CEO, he's just grabbing a cup of coffee before a meeting, and he sees something kind of unexpected.
Yeah, he notices how the employees are interacting. They're happy, looking out for each other in a way that maybe he hadn't experienced much in the business world. And it wasn't like they were putting on a show for the new boss, it was just how things worked there.
Right. And Chapman, he could easily have been like, oh, that's nice, and moved on. But instead, it totally changed his whole approach to leadership. Got rid of the time clocks, broke down those walls between the factory workers and the office staff, and just focused on treating everyone with respect. It's like he took that idea, sometimes the most radical thing a leader can do is treat people like human beings, and made it his company's whole philosophy.
And the science backs this up too, because when we feel safe and trusted, our brains release oxytocin. You might have heard it called the love hormone, and it's not just about warm fuzzies. It actually lowers stress and helps us collaborate and solve problems better. So Chapman, without even realizing it, he stumbled onto this biological advantage.
Like he found a cheat code for a better workplace, right? But here's the thing, what happens when that circle of safety, it falls apart? Sinek, he doesn't shy away from the kind of darker parts of human nature. He brings in the Milgram experiment, that one, right? Where they told people to give these electric shocks, sometimes even dangerous ones, just because some guy in a lab coat told them to.
Yeah, and it's crazy, kind of terrifying how many people were willing to go that far. 65% of them just followed orders. Now, I know that might seem like a weird jump from a leadership book, but Sinek uses it to show how this can play out in the corporate world.
Okay, so how does shocking someone in a lab, how's that even related to, layoffs or something?
It's about this thing called abstraction. When we're not directly confronted with the impact of our decisions, physically or emotionally, it becomes way easier to make choices we never even consider otherwise. Like CEOs who lay off tons of people just to make the shareholders happy. On a spreadsheet, it's just numbers, right? But in the real world, those are people's lives, families, communities, all affected. And that distance, that abstraction, it can lead to some messed up behavior.
Whoa. Makes you think, if a little bit of oxytocin goes a long way, how much damage does that kind of emotional disconnect do? Something for anyone in charge to think about, for sure. And this leads us to another one of Sinek's big ideas, the dopamine trap. Our brains, they love those little hits of pleasure, right? And in a lot of work environments, that pleasure comes from getting external validation, hitting targets, getting promoted, climbing that ladder. It's kind of like an addiction.
And here's the thing. Dopamine itself isn't a bad thing, obviously. It's what pushes us to achieve goals. But when we get fixated on that reward, when it's all about the next promotion or the bonus, it creates this culture of short-term thinking. And often it leads to people competing with each other instead of working together.
Which, ironically, can stifle innovation.
Yeah.
If everyone's so busy trying to outshine each other, who's looking at the big picture, the long-term vision, right?
Exactly. It's like the irony of the dopamine trap might feel good in the moment, but in the long run, it can totally backfire.
So we've got the positive power of oxytocin going head-to-head with the addictive pull of dopamine. So where do we go from here? Does Sinek offer any solutions to this whole mess? So we're kind of stuck in this leadership paradox, right? Wired for connection, wired for purpose, but so often we end up chasing those rewards. So how do we actually escape this dopamine trap? Well, Sinek, he actually offers a pretty simple antidote service. And I don't mean answering phones with a smile. He's talking about a deep, genuine focus on helping others, not just inside the company, but outside of it too.
And he uses a really interesting example to illustrate this whole thing. Alcoholics Anonymous. Think about that 12th step, right? The one about helping other alcoholics. It's not just about staying sober yourself. It's about finding purpose in helping someone else through the same thing.
So it's like shifting that focus outwards off of yourself. But how does that actually work in like a typical company?
Well, Sinek says that when leaders put their team's well-being first, it creates this ripple effect. He talks about this study where university fundraisers, they were way more successful when they got to actually meet the students who were getting the scholarships they were raising money for.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not enough to just tell people their work matters. They need to actually see it, feel it, you know.
It's that whole show, don't tell thing, but with like a scientific reason behind it. Seeing the impact of your work, it releases those feel-good chemicals, those serotonins, oxytocins, and that just fuels motivation. It gives you a sense of purpose.
Totally. And it goes way beyond just like saying good job or even giving bonuses. Sinek's point is that offering your time, your actual energy, that's way more valuable when it comes to building trust and loyalty. Think about it. We all have the same 24 hours, right? When someone chooses to spend theirs on you, it means something. It means more than a bonus check.
Yeah, it's like when someone goes above and beyond, right? Like a mentor who takes you under their wing or a coworker who stays late to help you finish something. It creates this bond that goes beyond just the task itself.
Exactly. And that leads to another big part of Sinek's argument, integrity. He says true leadership, it hinges on that quality. Like he points to this thing in the Marine Corps, they call it the foxhole test, basically.
Right.
Would you trust this person to have your back in a life or death situation? It's not about whether they're good at their job, it's about their character, you know?
Like, are they honest? Can you trust them? Will they do the right thing, even when it's hard? We all know people like that, right? People who stick to their principles even when you don't agree with them. It's about being consistent, being authentic.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. Sinek says that hypocrisy in leadership, that can absolutely destroy a company's culture. He uses this example of a Ralph Lauren executive who got caught bribing customs officials. And it wasn't just a couple of bad apples. This thing went all the way to the top.
It's like that saying, the fish rots from the head down, right? If the leaders aren't acting with integrity, how can you expect anyone else to?
And this ties right back into that dopamine trap we talked about. When it's all about hitting the numbers, achieving those external goals, well, ethics can get blurry. You know, it's a slippery slope for sure.
So is Sinek saying this whole drive for profit above everything else, is that like a systemic problem? Like even leaders with good intentions, they can get sucked into this race to the bottom. So then how do we even begin to address that?
Sinek says it starts with a total mindset shift. We need to remember the power of service. We need to put trust and connection first and start thinking about the long game, not just the immediate payoff.
So less me versus you and more us. It's a pretty big change from how we usually define success these days, you know, all that individualistic, competitive stuff. But how do we actually make that happen? It can't just be wishful thinking, right?
Right, and that's where Sinek's whole idea of step 12 comes in. It's about shifting your focus from personal gain to helping others. It's not about giving up ambition or anything. It's about redefining what success actually looks like.
So finding fulfillment in being a part of something bigger than yourself, it's a cool idea, but it also feels kind of huge, you know? Especially in today's world, everything's so fast-paced, so competitive. Where do you even begin?
Well, Sinek has some practical advice. He talks about building real relationships with your coworkers, being aware of how your decisions affect other people, and finding ways to, incorporate service into your everyday work.
So it's not about these grand gestures or changing like company policies overnight. It's about those small, consistent things you do, those little moments where you choose to put someone else's needs first.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of empathy, of support, one interaction at a time.
And this makes me think about another thing Sinek talks about, the abstraction problem. Our brains, they're made for face-to-face connection, but these days, so much of our interaction is through screens, you know?
Oh yeah, for sure. And technology is great, don't get me wrong, but it can also create this feeling of distance. It's easy to forget there's a real person on the other end of that email or text message.
So while we don't need to ditch technology altogether, it's probably smart to be more mindful about how we use it. Make an effort to prioritize those face-to-face moments, those times when you can connect with another human being, for real. Because building a circle of safety, that's not just a work thing, is it?
Not at all. These ideas, they apply to every part of life. Your family, your friends, your community, even how you interact with strangers.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Leaders Eat Last, It really hits home how important those circles of safety are, right? Not just at work, but with our families and our communities, just everywhere, really. It's a much bigger idea than you might think at first.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Sinek, he's not saying we should all just agree all the time and avoid conflict,
Yeah.
He actually says that a healthy circle of safety, it makes room for disagreement. It lets people voice their concerns, even disagree with each other, but in a way that's respectful, without being afraid of getting in trouble.
Right, so it's like the difference between blindly following orders and feeling like you can actually speak up when something seems wrong. But how do we create that kind of environment, especially these days? It feels like everyone's got an opinion, and social media, well, let's just say it doesn't always bring out the best in people.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a tough one. But at the heart of it, the Sinek's message is about, building bridges, not walls. It's about remembering that we're all human, even when we see things differently, and finding ways to connect on a deeper level, because that feeling of belonging, being a part of something bigger, it's so important for all of us.
It's pretty wild how Sinek connects those dots between our own well-being and the well-being of everyone around us. He talks about how loneliness, feeling isolated, it can be just as bad for you as smoking or not taking care of yourself.
And it's not just about individual health either. When people feel disconnected, disillusioned, it affects everything, our workplaces, our communities, even society as a whole. It creates this breeding ground for negativity, mistrust, and in some cases even violence. It's like we're all connected, whether we realize it or not.
So to create any kind of positive change, it has to start with those individual connections, building those circles of safety where trust and collaboration can actually happen. Makes you think about those times when you felt really supported, really fulfilled. What was it about those situations that made them so good? Was it a strong sense of purpose, everyone working towards the same goal? Or maybe just the feeling that people had each other's backs no matter what?
Yeah, those are the things that build a strong circle of safety for sure. And it's not just up to the CEOs or the politicians to make it happen. We all have the power to create that in our own lives,
So as you go about your day, your week, think about this. How can you help build those circles of safety? How can you create those pockets of trust and connection? Maybe it's at work, at home, or just in your everyday interactions. Remember, even the smallest acts of kindness, of empathy, they can make a difference.
It's about shifting our whole way of thinking, one interaction at a time, one conversation, one act of service. And that's really what Leaders Eat Last is all about, realizing that we're in this together. And if we want a better world, well, it starts with each of us choosing empathy, choosing integrity, choosing to help each other out.
And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Leaders Eat Last. We'll catch you next time for another exploration of the ideas shaping our world.
See you then.